What is a contract? When we strip it down to its fundamental parts, how do we really identify what a contract is, right? If we're going to learn about contract law, the very first thing we have to do is we have to be able to identify a contract, right? Welcome, class. I'm Professor Watson. This is Contracts Law, LGLA 1351. This is our first recording of week 2, if that helps you keep track. And today we're going to be talking about this fundamental concept before we launch into contract law about what specifically is a contract. Today we're going to talk about the basic elements of a contract. We're going to talk about a couple of different ways to categorize contracts. Because in doing so, that helps us understand how we enforce different types of contracts and how we identify those different types of contracts. And then we're even going to talk a little bit about some alternatives to contract, even in chapter 1, very first day. And that makes sense, right? As legal professionals, we know there's always rules, but there's always exceptions to the rules, and there's exceptions to the rules. And so if we're going to be a competent legal professional, then we need to learn about those things. And starting with the very fundamental concept of what is a contract is so important, not just for this class. Let me make sure that you pay attention to that. Not just for this class, but for any time in your career. If you practice 30 years, any time in your career where you have a contract law question, the very first thing you should do is go back to those fundamental principles. Start from the beginning. What is a contract? Okay. I can't tell you how many times I've had cases where I've watched the other lawyer lose because he's been practicing 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 years, right? And he just jumped into what he knows the law is, and he jumped into the story on, page 200. And he forgot to go back to those very basic principles, those fundamental principles of what is a contract. If you don't have things like an agreement, consideration, mutuality, then it doesn't matter how extensive your knowledge of contract law is. It doesn't matter how creative you are or what kind of special case you found that meets your special circumstances. If you don't have the fundamental elements of a contract, then you don't have anything, right? So let me urge you, and I'll mention this time and time again throughout the semester. In this class, if you take any of my other classes, you'll hear it there too. And in torts and criminal law and all those things, it is so important to start every question by going back to these first principles. So I love this class. It's chapter 1 of the book. Chapter 1 of the book is what is a contract, or what is contract law? And I think it's an excellent place to start, not only this semester, but it's an excellent place to start every contracts related to legal question that you have. Okay. So again, this is a week 2. This is our first lecture of week 2. We're starting on chapter 1 in the book. What is contract law? If you've looked at your course materials, you should have found my lecture notes. If those help you, great. If not, then follow along and take your own notes. So you should also find the PowerPoint in the class materials. If that helps you, great. Then follow along there. Otherwise, I'm getting ready to put it up on the screen. But let me see if I can share my screen with you. Let's start with the PowerPoint. And so if you're looking for our materials, this will be the same information we started with last week. We just we did a brief introduction to the book, and now we're starting on chapter 1. What is contract law? So at the very beginning, let's start with a good definition of what is a contract, okay? And I tell my students all the time, don't think you've memorized the law. Learn the law, learn to use the law, but you always look the law up because things can change, right? Well, this is one of those exceptions. This is one of those times where it is so important to memorize this fundamental definition of a contract, because like I said, every time you have a contract question, you should go back to the very beginning. You should go back to these fundamental principles of what is a contract. Your book gives a definition of a contract law, of what is a contract. You could look up Black's Law Dictionary and find a couple of different definitions there. You could look at any number, thousands of reported cases. Judges will all have slightly different definitions. And so the definition you read, the definition you find someplace may not be word for word identical to this, but I think this is an excellent definition of what is a contract, okay? And so this is worth memorizing. A contract is a set of legally enforceable promises entered into between two or more parties, right? a set of legally enforceable promises entered into between two or more parties. That's not many words, but there are a lot of elements packed in there. We're going to kind of unpack some of that today. Many definitions will go on a little bit farther, and they will continue that it's a set of legally enforceable promises entered into between two or more parties to make their dealings predictable or to allocate risk. That's certainly true. When you enter into a contract to buy a car, buy a house, or buy a hamburger, why do you do that? Because you want everybody to know, what are my obligations? I'm going to give you the money. And what are your obligations? You're going to give me a car. Is it just any car? No, it's a new Mustang, or it's a Fiat. You don't want to be surprised by that. So that contract makes those dealings predictable. When am I going to get the car? I'm going to get it on Thursday. When am I going to pay you? I'm not going to pay you until I get the car, right? So making dealings predictable is certainly something that contracts do. Likewise, to allocate risk. Well, not every contract is about allocating risk. Some contracts are fairly simple. When you go up to McDonald's and you order a Big Mac at the counter, there's not a whole lot of risk involved, right? You're going to give them money. They're going to give you the burger. It's not like if you give them the money and then the restaurant burns down, you're not going to get your food. There's very little risk there. But lots of contracts are about allocating risk and making dealings predictable. And so that's certainly a useful addition. But I think fundamentally what you should memorize is this first part. A contract is a set of legally enforceable promises entered into between two or more parties. Okay, that's so important. And again, 30 years from now, if you're a paralegal or a legal professional, or you've become a lawyer, or hell, if you're a judge for the U.S. Supreme Court and you have a contract case come in front of you, I hope you will start your consideration of that case before the Supreme Court with, well, what is the fundamental definition of a contract? It is a set of legally enforceable promises entered into between two or more parties. And then you'll move on next to what are the elements of a contract, okay? The fundamental elements of a contract. Let's take a brief detour. We had a short lecture about the introduction to the book for our first week. I'm not sure everybody paid attention to that or was even here for that. So let me point out the one important, or maybe the main important part of that. And that's, where does contract law live? Right? We talked last week, if you were here, if you missed it, then this will be good for you. We talked about there's basically two types of law. There's criminal law, and then there's civil law, right? If you wrong somebody in a way that violates the criminal law, that violates the peace and dignity of the state, then you have committed a crime. And those crimes are always they're always defined and identified by statute. That's a constitutional requirement. Criminal cases, crimes are always they're always brought and prosecuted by the government, right? The state or the city or the federal government. Crimes are always punishable by criminal penalties. So things like fines or prison time, right? Or jail, probation, those kind of things. So a crime, those are those punishable infractions against the peace and dignity of the community that the government cares about, that the government has the responsibility of enforcing, and that when the government enforces it, they can fine you, they can put you in jail, they can assign those kind of criminal penalties. All right, that's in contrast to a tort. I don't know if any of you have had tort law or personal injury law yet, but a tort is a private or a civil wrong for which an individual can bring suit. Okay, so if you murder someone, then the police are going to arrest you, and the state is going to prosecute you for murder. That's a crime. That case is going to be State versus Watson, and the state is going to prosecute me and try to put me in jail. Okay, if I breach a contract, though, a contract is your book says contracts is tort. That's not exactly true, but a contract is in the nature of a tort. It's a civil wrong. Okay, so it's important to understand that in a breach of contract case, that's going to be a private or a civil suit. One party of the contract against another party of the contract, maybe even one beneficiary under the contract against one party of the contract. It's a civil case. The government is not involved as a party. The government's only involvement is as the court, the judge. Maybe if you get a judgment, there'll be some enforcement mechanisms. But a breach of contract case is a civil matter. It's A versus B, Watson versus Jones, Jones versus Smith, Delta Airlines versus Exxon, right? Those are a breach of contract cases. Why is that important? Because again, a breach of contract, your book says, is a tort, not exactly a tort, but it's a civil wrong. Those are brought in civil cases with civil judges in civil courtrooms. No one is ever going to jail for breach of contract, okay? Because it's a civil wrong. You do not call the cops when somebody breaches a contract. The DA is not interested if somebody breaches their contract with you, right? And so if you're sitting around the dinner table with your family and you're talking about a breach of contract, don't you dare say they can't do that. That's illegal, right? It's not illegal if we're talking about breach of contract. When we say illegal, we usually mean that something is a crime. And breach of contract is a civil matter. So that's something that's handled between individuals. Nobody's going to jail for breach of contract, okay? So again, let's get back to what is a contract. Let's talk about the elements of a contract. Your book says there are 4 elements of every contract. I agree with your book. If you read the case law is pretty consistent on that. And so you can look at the screen and you can see that I've got 5 elements, right? Why do we have 5 elements if there's 4 elements to every contract? Well, it depends on how you group these things together. It depends on, on how you split them apart. What do you consider an actual element versus just a circumstance? But your book says there are 4 elements to every contract. And so I'm going to continue to say, I'm going to continue to say there are 4 elements to every contract. There's an agreement, consideration, mutuality, capacity, and that 4th one, legality. So we're going to go over that this whole semester. We'll talk when we get to capacity and legality about whether that's an actual element or it's just something that applies to every contract. Okay, so whether you count at 4, whether you count at 5, whether I count at 4 or 5. These elements are necessary in every single contract. These are fundamental. And again, it's one of those things that I encourage you every time you ever breach a contract case, even if you're sitting on the U.S. Supreme Court, to go back to these fundamental elements of every single contract. Because if you're missing one of these elements, you do not have a contract, okay? Every single contract has to have every single one of these elements. All right, so let's look at what they are. The first element of every contract is an agreement, right? You sometimes hear that called a meeting of the minds. Both sides had to agree on the same thing. And we'll look at that. We'll look at in the next chapters on we're going to split that down even smaller on what is an agreement. We'll spend an entire chapter on what is an agreement. It's a meeting of the minds. Both sides they have to agree to exactly the same thing. It involves mutual assent. Nobody can force you into a contract. You have to agree to a contract. Both sides have to agree to a contract. How do you know if both sides have agreed to a contract? Well, we usually have things like offer and acceptance, and we'll talk about those in the coming chapters. Okay, but it's important to understand the first element of every single contract is an agreement. And the cliche you're going to see over and over and over and over again in every single case, they're going to talk about this meeting of the minds. Did the contracting parties meet in exactly the same place? That's an agreement. Okay. Next element of every contract, element number 2, is consideration. And again, we have a whole chapter on consideration. Consideration is very important because if you have everything else but you don't have consideration, well, then you don't have a contract. Because again, you need every one of these 4 or 5 elements to have a contract. What is consideration? Well, we'll talk about that in a couple of chapters, but consideration is basically what you give, right? When we get to that chapter, I'll give you my own personal definition, which is consideration is what you give for what you get, right? So if you go to McDonald's and you buy a Big Mac, you gave $5, you got a Big Mac. McDonald's got $5, they gave a Big Mac. What is the consideration? The consideration is $5 and a Big Mac, right? It's that simple. You'll see listed under consideration that bullet point there, peppercorn. Where does that come from? Well, we'll talk about this more when we get to consideration, but you will be interested to find out that the courts, while consideration is required, the courts don't care what consideration you contracted for. They only care about, did you get the consideration that you were promised? Did you get the consideration that was promised in the contract? So going back hundreds of years, in fact, hundreds and hundreds of years, in this country, we adopted most of our contract law through common law. That common law came mostly from England and from Western Europe, when European settlers came to the United States or came to the Americas and we set up this country, we adopted that common law. So this concept of consideration goes back even before the first Europeans landed in the United States. And back then, you can imagine a peppercorn was a little more valuable, right? Then before Columbus tried to circumnavigate the globe just so that he could find a quicker way to get to India to bring back these spices like peppercorns, peppercorns were a little more valuable. But the point is still that a single peppercorn is fairly minor, right? That's fairly insignificant, but it's still something. And so if I have a contract to buy a brand new Maserati in exchange for a single peppercorn, we'll learn that contract is supported by consideration. What am I giving? I'm giving a peppercorn. What am I getting? I'm getting a Maserati, right? What is the dealership getting? They're getting a peppercorn. They're giving a Maserati. So is there consideration? And we'll talk about this much more in depth in future chapters. And the answer is yes. Both sides gave something, both sides got something. And maybe after the fact, the dealership says, no, wait a minute, all I got was a peppercorn. Somebody pulled the wool over my eyes. This isn't much. Court, I've had second thoughts. Undo this contract. The court's going to say, no. The element is, was there consideration? Not was there sufficient consideration, or are you happy with the consideration, or does the judge think the consideration was enough, right? It's not up to the judge. He's going to look at the parties and say, you entered into a contract. Did you get what you contracted for? Did you get the consideration? And consideration can even be a single peppercorn, right? As long as it's something, you got something, as long as that's what you contracted for, then a peppercorn is enough. Now, if we contracted for a Maserati for $100,000 and I show up with a peppercorn, that's not consideration. That's not what we agreed to, right? But if the contract says Maserati for a peppercorn, then we have consideration. And that's the second element of a contract, okay? So first element is an agreement or a meeting of the minds. The second element is consideration, okay? Consideration. The next element of contract is mutuality. You'll see that third bullet point there, mutuality. What is mutuality? Well, mutuality, again, we go back to that original definition of contract, right? A contract is a set of legally enforceable promises between two or more parties, right? Two or more parties. You got to have at least two parties to have a contract. If you don't have two parties, no contract. And that's where mutuality comes in. You have to have at least two parties. Can you have three? Yes. Four? Yes. 1,000? Yes. But you got to have at least two. If you've got one party to a contract, no contract, right? You may have an unenforceable promise. I promise to give you $1,000 for your birthday. Well, I'm the only one in that, right? That's not a contract. That is a promise. You didn't promise anything back. There's no mutuality. That's a one-sided contract. I told you my definition of consideration was what you give for what you get, meaning both sides have to both give and get something. There have to be at least two sides to a contract. That's mutuality. Both sides have to enter into that agreement. There has to be an agreement, a meeting of the minds. They have to meet in the same place, not almost met, but they have to meet in the same place. If we're not both agreeing to the same thing, then we don't have an agreement. If there's not at least two of us, if we're not both giving and getting something, then we don't have mutuality, okay? So we have to have an agreement, a meeting of the minds between two people. We have to have consideration, something given, something gotten. We have to have mutuality. Both sides have to give something. Both sides have to get something. It's not enough that one party gives and gets and the other side just gets, right? That's no mutuality, no consideration. Both sides have to give and get something. What do they have to give or get? They have to give or get what they agreed to. Both sides have to agree to something. You can't have one party forcing a contract down another party's throat. Now, you all may say, Watson, that's a bold-faced lie because I have a cell phone contract and I didn't have anything to do with agreeing to that cell phone contract. AT&T crammed it down my throat and I had no other options. So no mutuality. So Watson says I can go get out of the cell phone contract. No, unfortunately, you did have a choice. You didn't have much power. You didn't have many choices, but you had at least one choice, and that was to accept the contract with AT&T or not, and you chose to accept it. Okay, so unfortunately, you all can't get out of your cell phone contracts. You have mutuality there because AT&T gave you all the terms, and in order to get that new cell phone, you agreed to them. You both got something. You got a new cell phone, you got a new iPhone, you got a cell phone plan, and you gave something. You gave money every month. AT&T gave something. They gave you that new cell phone, or they gave you that cell phone service, and they got something. You paid them every month. So there is mutuality, right? Both sides were involved in negotiating. Both sides agreed to what they were giving and getting, and both sides have a right to enforce that contract. Remember the first part of that definition, an enforceable set of agreements. Both parties have a right to enforce that contract to make sure that they get the consideration that they contracted for. Okay, so mutuality is the third element of contract. So number one, an agreement, a meeting of the minds. Number two, consideration. That's what you give for what you get. Number three is that mutuality, making sure that both parties, at least both parties, right? If there's two, if there's 3 or 10 or 1,000, all those parties have to be involved as well. But did they both have a chance to contract for what they wanted, what they were giving, what they were getting? And did they agree to that? And is it enforceable? Can both sides enforce the contract? Or can all 10 sides, or can all 1,000 sides enforce the contract? That's mutuality, okay? Let's look at the next one. The next one is capacity, right? Capacity. You may informally enter into any kind of contract with anyone you want, and you can call that a contract. You can have an agreement with your 14-year-old brother, that if he cleans your room, you will take him to Whataburger, right? It sounds like a legally enforceable contract. The problem is, what we're talking about in contract law is not just every contract. We've narrowed it down to a definition of legally enforceable promises. Legally enforceable promises. And the problem is that contract law has a requirement for capacity, that both sides to the contract are legally competent, that they both have the ability, the legal ability to enter into a contract. And we'll talk about that in several chapters down the road. But you're already aware of some of those requirements, right? Like there's some exceptions to the rule, but you probably can't enter into a contract with your 14-year-old brother because he's under 18, right? You probably can't enter into a contract with a crazy old man who's in a mental institution, right? He's probably not competent. And so the court is going to protect him and say, no, that you may have something that looks like a contract. It might smell like a contract. But one of the elements of a contract is capacity, and legally, somebody who's been declared incompetent, or insane, or somebody who is under the age of 18, generally, the law deems them to not have capacity to enter into a contract. So, if you're 14 and you need to enter into a contract, what do you do? Well, it's pretty hard. There are some exceptions to the rule, and we're not going to talk about those today. We'll talk about those when we get to the chapter on capacity, okay? Because capacity is important. You can have an agreement between 2 or more parties. You can have consideration where both are giving and getting something. You can have mutuality where they both intended to be able to enforce this agreement. But one of the parties was Justin Bieber, and he was 14 when he signed this recording contract. So is it enforceable? Do we have an enforceable contract? Well, if you're finding the next pop prodigy, if you're trying to sign the next 14-year-old Justin Bieber, you better be very careful, because if he does not have capacity, that contract is not going to be enforceable. That's a necessary element of every contract, okay? There's one more element. Your book sometimes talks about legality and capacity together. And so that's why they say 4. I think legality and capacity are different. So I'm going to break them out. And so do we call it 4 elements of a contract or 5 elements of a contract? It's not really important how you count them. It's not really important how you group them. It's important that they always exist, okay? And legality is one that often gets forgotten. Let me go back and show you the PowerPoint to make sure everybody's got the list. Legality is this last one. And so we can think of legality as an element of the contract, or you can think of it as a condition that just has to exist in order for a contract to be enforceable, whatever. But every contract has to be legal. And again, we'll have a whole chapter on that. We'll talk about it later. But what are we talking about? Well, if I go buy a Big Mac for $5, perfectly legal, nothing wrong with that, right? If I buy a house for $1 million, perfectly legal, nothing wrong with that. But what if what if I sign a contract? We've got an agreement, a meeting of the minds. We both have agreed to exactly the same thing. The consideration, we both have agreed on that. I'm giving something and getting something. You're getting something and giving something. We have mutuality. It appears to be enforceable by both of us. We're both competent adults. We have a contract, right? Yes. Is it enforceable? Sure, unless it's illegal. What if that contract is I'm going to give you $1 million to bump off my boss, right? I should change that before I get fired. What if it's a contract I'm going to give you $1 million to bump off my brother, right? I'm trying to get him out of the will. I want to inherit everything. It looks like a contract. We have an agreement, me and the hitman, right? We've both agreed to the same thing. We have consideration. I'm going to give $1 million. I'm going to get my brother murdered. The hitman, he's going to get $1 million. He's going to do a little murdering. We have mutuality. I mean, it appears that we can both enforce that contract. If he murders my brother and I don't pay, well, then I should be able to sue, right? And if I pay the $1 million, he doesn't murder my brother, well, again, I should be able to sue, right? We have mutuality there. We even have capacity. We're both over the age of 18. We're adults. This should be enforceable, right? Well, you know, there is no court in the world that is going to say, well, he paid you the $1 million, so I guess you got to go murder his brother now, right? Or he murdered his brother, I guess you owe him the $1 million. No, the court is not going to enforce that. And in a separate crime, we're both going to jail, right? But the point is, a court's not going to enforce an illegal contract, okay? Now, that can get much broader, much more nuanced than something as simple as paying somebody $1 million to bump off my brother. But is that an element, or is it just a condition that has to exist? Is it a negative that can defeat a contract, right? You have the 4 elements. You have agreement, consideration, mutuality, and capacity. But you can think of legality as something that would then come in and defeat a contract. Fine, however you want to think of it. But there's basically 4 elements or 5 elements of a contract. And so let's make sure that we include legality so that we don't ever forget about it. Okay, a contract, the subject of a contract has to be legal. Go back to that original definition of a contract. It's a set of enforceable agreements between 2 or more parties. If that contract is not enforceable, if it's not legal, if the subject matter of the contract is not legal, you don't have a contract. Okay, so learn those elements, memorize those elements. Again, you can look far and wide. You can search every contract case in the United States. If the judge bothered to go back to the fundamental concepts and talk about the 4 elements or the 5 elements of a contract, he's going to name those 4 every single time, or those 5 every single time. They may number them different. They may group them different, but contract law across the entire United States, and in fact, mostly in England, those 4 or 5 elements of a contract: agreement, consideration, mutuality, capacity, legality. Okay, every single time you're going to hear me mention this, you're going to get tired of it because I'm going to drill it every single lecture we have. There are 5 elements of a contract: an agreement, consideration, mutuality, capacity, legality. If you're missing any of those, right, no contract. All right, so it's a good fundamental place to start. And again, I'm going to repeat it every single class we have. Let's move on though. There are a number of different ways that we can categorize types of contracts. Okay, one way is every single contract falls into one of these 2 categories. Every single contract is either express or implied. Okay, express or implied, and it's important to be able to identify an express versus an implied contract so that you can see if a contract was created. Let's talk about the difference between an express and an implied contract. Well, an express contract, that's the easiest, right? An express contract is where the explicit obligations of the contract have been stated, right? They've either been written down or they've been stated out loud. You could have an oral express contract, or you could have a written express contract. But if all of the details of the agreement are written out, then it's an express contract. Okay, so a written contract is always an express contract, right? You wrote out the elements of the contract. But not every express contract is written. You can have an oral express contract, as long as you stated the elements of the contract. You stated the elements of the agreement and the consideration and the mutuality, right? By the same token, while every written contract is express, there can be extra elements that just didn't get written down, right? If there's extra parts that didn't get written down, that part may also be implied. Okay, so an express contract is where the terms have been stated. I will give you $1,000 for your car. You will take $1,000 for your car. We have an express agreement. Whether we wrote that down or whether we just said it out loud, whether it was a handshake deal, that is an express agreement. I will cut your hair for $35. Okay, well, I will pay you $35 to cut my hair. That is an express agreement. I will pay AT&T way too much money every month in order for it to get a cell phone. AT&T will give me barely competent service, and my phone will break up all the time, but it'll work sometimes. And in exchange, they're going to charge me $1 million a month. That's an express agreement. Okay, but that's not the only type of contract that is enforceable. We can also have implied agreements. And you may say, wait a minute, if I didn't agree to something, how is it enforceable? Well, the fact is, you enter into implied agreements almost every single day of your life, right? If you're an adult, a competent adult who goes outside and engages in commerce in this country, you are engaging in implied contracts almost every single day of your life. And we need those. We need those to make commerce work, and so that we can trade with other people and trade goods and services. And if they weren't enforceable, then commerce would grind to a halt, right? So an implied contract is a contract where the terms of the agreement haven't been explicitly stated in words, but where the terms of the contract can be implied from the circumstances. Okay. Now, an implied agreement may be more difficult to prove to a court. If you have a written agreement, right, you can just show the court the contract. You can say, here's the terms of our agreement, judge. Here's the terms of our agreement, jury. With an implied contract, even if it's an oral agreement, right, you can go to the judge or go to the jury and say, I said this, they said that. That's an express agreement. But an implied agreement is implied by the conduct of the parties. And we'll deal with this a lot more along the semester. But an implied agreement is one where the terms are implied by the conduct of the party. So it may not be as easy to prove. But if you can prove from your conduct and from your actions that you all agreed to a contract, even though the explicit terms weren't written down, or even though the explicit terms weren't stated, then that's an implied contract, and it's just as enforceable as an express contract. Now, again, maybe harder to prove, but just as enforceable if you can prove it. Let me give you an example. If you go to McDonald's and you say, I will give you $6 for a Big Mac, and the person behind the counter says, okay, I will give you a Big Mac for $6, then you have an express contract. And many of you have been to McDonald's. Some of you eat Big Macs, and none of you, not one single one of you, has ever entered into an express contract for a Big Mac. No, you walked up to the counter and you said, I'll take a number one. And they said, okay. And they wandered off and they got your food and they put it in a bag or they put it on a tray and they set it on the counter, right? And did you snatch it and run off and eat it and say, ha, 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 I don't have to pay because I never explicitly agreed? No. And if you did, they're going to call the cops, and the cops are going to arrest you because you committed a crime. You committed a crime of theft. They're not going to arrest you for the breach of contract, but you did have a contract. And everybody knows it because everybody's been to a McDonald's. Everybody's been to a restaurant. We understand how it works. If you sit down at a nicer restaurant, you look at the menu and you tell the waiter, yeah, I'll have the steak. And, bring me a steak and a Coke. And they bring it and they put the food on the table and you eat it and you enjoy it. And then you stand up and you try to walk out. And you say, ha, 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 I never agreed to pay. Is there any jury in the world that's going to let you walk out because you didn't explicitly agree to pay? No, because everybody knows what the terms of that agreement are, and they were implied by your conduct, right? Because we all know how restaurants work. We know we come in, we know we see the menu, we know if we order, we're going to have to pay for it. And how much are we going to pay for it? Are we going to just pay whatever we want? No, we're going to pay that price in the menu, right? When we order it, we impliedly agreed that contract. And those implied agreements are just as enforceable as express agreements. Okay, so one way to categorize contracts is express versus implied. Every single contract is either express or implied, or maybe a little bit of both, right? If you don't get all the terms, we explicitly agreed to some things, but some other things you can just see from our conduct. That's what we intended. We'll talk a lot more about that this semester. But every single contract can be categorized either as express or implied or both. There's nothing out here, right? There's nothing that is neither express nor implied. If it's neither express nor implied, it ain't a contract. Okay, so that can be a useful way to categorize contracts, so that if we need to enforce the contract, if we need to determine what the terms of the contract are, we still have to meet those 5 elements. We still have to decide what was the agreement, what was the consideration, was there mutuality, right? Well, if it was never explicitly said, how do we do that? Well, we look at the conduct of the parties. So when you sit down at a restaurant, you order that steak and the Coke. Is there an agreement? Yes, by your conduct. The terms of that agreement are implied, right? And what's the consideration? Well, it's $20 for a steak, $2 for a Coke, whatever it is. Is there mutuality? Sure. If they don't bring your food, you don't owe them any money. If they bring your food, you owe them the money. Is there capacity? Presumably. Is it legal? Sure. It's not illegal to sell somebody a steak. So you would have the elements of a contract, even though they haven't been expressly stated. Again, that can be useful if we're trying to determine what the terms of the contract are. We need to know how to prove those, and we're going to look at those. Look at the conduct of the parties. Look at kind of traditions and what are common business practices, right? Those are the things we're going to use to determine those elements of those implied contracts. But every single contract, either express or implied. Okay. Let's talk about another way to categorize contracts. And please understand, this is a completely different category. Every contract is either express or implied. Now let's set that aside. And we have another way to categorize contracts, and that is either unilateral or bilateral. Okay, but 2 categories, unrelated. You can have an express unilateral contract. You can have an implied unilateral contract. You can have an express bilateral contract. You can have an implied bilateral contract. So don't get the 2 confused. There's express versus implied. Then there's unilateral versus bilateral. Let me throw that back up on the screen so you can see it. So what is a unilateral versus a bilateral contract first? Let's discuss what they are, and then we'll talk about why you need to know. Well, a bilateral contract, let's start with that, because that's the one you think of most when you think of a contract. Bi means 2, right? You have a bicycle, it's got 2 wheels. You have a biplane, it's got 2 wings, right? Bi just means 2, and lateral means side. Any of you play football, right? If the quarterback throws a lateral, he's not throwing it forward, he's throwing it to the side, right? So bilateral just means 2-sided. We just said a minute ago that, well, every contract has to have at least 2 sides. So what do we mean by, a 2-sided contract? Isn't every contract a 2-sided contract? Well, not exactly. When we talk about bilateral, what we're talking about is promises, right? Promises. So if I promise to pay you $100 on Friday, if you sell me your car on Friday, and we shake hands, that's enforceable agreement. We haven't exchanged anything yet, right? It's executory. It hasn't been completed yet. I haven't done my part. You haven't done your part. On Friday, I've promised to give you $100. And on Friday, you've promised to give me your car. That is a bilateral contract because we have an exchange of promises, okay? So when we're talking about bilateral, unilateral, what we're talking about are how many promises were exchanged. So bilateral contract, 2-sided, we have an exchange of a promise for a promise, all right? So, okay, I get that, but then what is a unilateral contract? So a unilateral contract, if bi means 2, uni just means 1, right? Unicycle has 1 wheel, bicycle has 2. A uniform, there's 1 form, right? Everybody wears the same uniform. Lateral still means side. So unilateral just means 1-sided. So a unilateral contract is a contract in which only one side makes a promise, okay? Only one side makes a promise. The other side can accept only through performance, not by offering a promise. Okay. And so for this reason, we say that a unilateral contract is executory, meaning that a unilateral contract, since there's only one promise going one way, it can't be accepted by another promise. It can only be accepted by performance, by doing the thing that you were required to do. So we would say that a unilateral contract is executory, meaning that no one is obligated to do anything on the contract until the second party fully executes or performs his side of the agreement. Okay, so a unilateral contract, again, there's a promise going one way, and that promise can only be accepted through performance, through doing something, not by promising to do something. And as a result, we would call that contract executory until one side actually performs their agreement. That sounds a little weird, sounds a little confusing. Let me give you some examples. If I need my house painted and I call a house painter and he comes over and I say, if he says, I can paint your house next week. And I say, okay, how much? He says $1,000. I say, okay, I'll pay you $1,000 if you paint my house next week. He says, we got a deal. We shake on it. Maybe we write that up in an agreement. We sign it. We have a bilateral contract. I have promised to pay him. He has promised to paint my house. If he doesn't show up and paint my house, I can sue him, right? I'm like, well, I had a deal. You were going to paint my house for $1,000. That was a great deal. And now I can't find anybody to do it for less than $2,000. So I can sue him to enforce that contract because he promised, right? We exchanged promises. He promised to paint. I promised to pay. Likewise, if he shows up and paints the house, well, then I have to pay him because I promised to pay. He can enforce the contract. All right. But I could have phrased that contract a different way. What if I said, I will pay you $1,000 if you paint my house. I'll pay you $1,000 if you paint my house on Monday. Okay. He doesn't have to say anything. He can just walk off, right? Do we have an agreement? Well, we have a unilateral agreement. I have promised to pay him if he paints my house on Monday. If he doesn't show up to paint my house on Monday, do I owe him anything? No, he didn't complete his side of the agreement. If he doesn't show up to paint my house on Monday, do I have to pay him? No, because there's no contract formed. It was executory until, I'm sorry, maybe I just said the same thing. If he doesn't show up on Monday to paint the house, can I sue him? No, because he never promised to paint my house, right? I promised to pay if he painted my house. So we don't have a complete contract yet because we don't have that mutuality, right? We don't have enforceability by both sides. But if he shows up Monday and he starts painting my house, now we have a contract, right? Because he showed up and started painting. He has accepted his obligations by performance. We'll talk about what performance means later on. But that's a unilateral contract. So a bilateral contract is an exchange of promises between two or more people. I promise to paint your house if you promise to pay me $1,000. I promise to pay you $1,000 if you promise to pay my house. We shake on it. We got a contract. That's a bilateral contract. But I will pay you $1,000 if you paint my house. Only one promise, right? Only one promise going one way. And so that's a unilateral contract. It's executory. It's not enforceable until the painter shows up and starts painting. Once he does, now he's accepted the contract. Now we have an enforceable agreement going both ways. He's going to owe me finishing the house and I'm going to owe him $1,000. Okay. So bilateral versus unilateral. Why is it important to understand the difference? Well, because we've got those elements of a contract, right? And we need to identify whether we have an enforceable contract or whether we have an enforceable contract yet, right? I will pay you $1,000 if you show up Monday and paint my house is not an enforceable contract yet. But the second he shows up and starts painting, we have an enforceable contract. And if he tries to sue me and I say, whoa, we never had a contract, you never promised anything back. His lawyer, if he doesn't understand the difference between a bilateral contract and a unilateral contract, may go, oh my gosh, we're stuck, right? Because you never promised to paint the house. No. That's a unilateral contract. I promised to pay you if, and you showed up and started doing it. So now we have all the elements of a contract, right? Part of that is implied, part of it is express. But we have two parties, right? We have a meeting of the minds. When you show up and start painting, we both know what's going on here. You're going to paint the house. I'm going to give $1,000. We have consideration. I'm giving $1,000. I'm getting a painted house. You're getting $1,000. You're giving a painting of a house, right? So we have consideration. We have mutuality. Once you start painting, we can both enforce that contract. So we have consideration, presuming that's not illegal, and that we're both over 18 and have capacity. That's an enforceable agreement, even though it's unilateral, even though it's one-sided. Okay, but let's make sure that we understand the difference between a unilateral contract, which can be enforceable once it's begun, versus a one-sided gift. Okay, a one-sided gift, that's just where just one person is involved, and a gift is not enforceable. Okay, so let's move on to that, and let's talk about the difference between a unilateral contract and a gift. Okay, a gift, your book puts this under alternatives to contract. Okay, make sure you understand that not all of these alternatives to contract are the same, right? Some of these alternatives to contract can be enforced, but not a gift. A gift is unenforceable. Okay, a gift. Let's talk about a little terminology. In a gift, you usually have two parties. You have the donor, the person who is giving the gift, and you have the donee, the person getting the gift. Okay, a donor and a donee. The donor gives the gift, the donee gets the gift. It comes from the same word as donated, right? To give. The donor is the giver, the donee is the givee, the person receiving the gift. So I promise to give you $1,000 next week. Is that enforceable? No, because it's not a contract. We have a donor, me, I've promised to give you $1,000. I'm sorry, a donor, and we have a donee, you, because you'd love to receive $1,000, but we don't have a contract. Why? Because we don't have consideration, right? And again, we'll talk more about consideration, but let's make sure we understand that a gift is one-sided, but it's not a unilateral contract. There's no way to accept that contract, because even if you try to take the $1,000, I haven't gotten anything back. Okay, there's no consideration, so a gift is not enforceable, or at least it's not enforceable until it's complete. Okay, the law does say basically what you all learned on the playground in kindergarten. There's no backsies, right? No takebacks. Once a gift is given, it's given, and there are no takebacks. You can't unenforce a gift, or you can't say, well, since there was no consideration, I'm going to take my gift back. No, a gift is enforceable, but only once the gift is complete. And how do we know if a gift is complete? Well, there has to be two things. Two things are necessary for a completed gift. There has to be delivery, but there also has to be acceptance. Okay, there has to be delivery, but there also has to be acceptance, and you have to have both. Okay, so if I promise to give you $1,000 and you go take it out of my wallet, not a gift. I can get that money back because I didn't give it. I didn't deliver it to you. You went and took it. All right. If I promise to give you $1,000, and so I drive over to your house after class and I put $1,000 in your mailbox and I drive off, but you're not home. And as I'm driving home, I started thinking, why in the world am I giving my students $1,000? This is crazy, right? I don't need the Yelp reviews that bad. What am I doing? And so I go back to your house and I go up to the mailbox, and you haven't touched it yet. You haven't accepted the gift. And I take that $1,000 out of the mailbox and I drive home and I go, whoo, that was a close one, right? Can you sue me for the $1,000? No, because it was a gift. There was no exchange of promises. I'm not getting any consideration back. And the gift was given, but it wasn't accepted yet. It wasn't accepted before I took it back. Okay. So a gift is generally one-sided, and it is not enforceable until it's complete. A gift is not complete until it is both given and accepted. All right, both given and accepted. That makes an enforceable gift. So if your grandfather promises to, or your dad promises to pay your tuition to college, when you grow up, it's really important for me that you go to college, so I'll pay your tuition to college. And then before you start college, your mom and dad get divorced, right? Or your dad loses his job, or y'all just have a fight. Your dad just doesn't like you anymore, right? And so you finish high school and you go, okay, great. I'm going to start college now. Write me that check, Dad. And he says, nope, not going to do it. Taking that back. Do you have a contract? No. It was one-sided. He promised that he would pay for college. He didn't promise anything in return. There's no enforceable agreement back, right? No consideration, no mutuality. And while it had been offered, it hadn't been delivered and accepted yet, right? If he wrote you a check, for tuition and you accepted it, then he can't take that back. But if he hasn't paid your tuition yet, what you have is an unenforceable gift. Okay. Tell you what, let's stop right there. We have two more alternatives to contract to finish, and then we'll be done with chapter 1. We're going to talk about promissory estoppel, and then something called quasi-contract, or what I like to call it is quantum meruit. But let's talk about promissory estoppel and quantum meruit in the next video to break these up a little bit, make them a little bit shorter. So that concludes this first lecture on chapter 1. If you have any questions, please shoot me an email, give me a call. You can come by my classes and ask anytime, or we can set up a meeting for office hours, something like that. Okay. So if you haven't read chapter 1, if you haven't looked at my course notes, you've got those available to you. Go back and take a look at them before you do the quiz, before you do your memo assignment. And in the meantime, let's get ready for the second half of chapter 1, what is and what is not a contract. Thanks so much.